by 3 bells that morning, they were all stirring their legs, for there was a big sea running, and Tootles was among them, with a rope's end in his ham and chewing tobacco.
They all donned pirate clothes cut off at the knee, shaved smartly and tumbled up with a true nautical roll and hitching their trousers.
It need not to be said who was the captain.
Nibs and John were first and second mate.
Now, Peter had already lashed himself to the wheel, but he piped,
"All hands!"
and delivered a short address to them. He said he hoped they would do their duty like gallant hearties, but that he knew they were the scum of Rio and the Gold Coast, and if they snapped at him, he would tear them.
The bluff, strident words struck the notes sailors understood, and they cheered him lustily. Then a few sharp orders were given, and they turned the ship round and nosed her for the mainland.
Some of the crew wanted to be an honest ship, and others were in favour of keeping it a pirate. But the captain treated them as dogs, and they dared not express their wishes, even to him, in a round robin.
Instant obedience was the only safe thing.
But Slightly he got a dozen for looking perplexed when told to take soundings.
The general feeling was that Peter was honest just now to lull Wendy's suspicions, but that there might be a change when the new suit was ready, which, against her will, she was making for him out of some of Hook's wickedest garments.
It was afterward whispered among them that on the first night he wore this suit and sat long in the cabin with Hook's cigar holder in his mouth and one hand clenched, all but the forefinger, which he bent and held threateningly aloft like a hook.
Well, instead of watching the ship, however, we must now return to that desolate home from which 3 of our characters had taken heartless flight so long ago. It seems a shame to have neglected number 14 all this time, and yet we may be sure that Mrs. Darling does not blame us.
If we had returned sooner to look with sorrowful sympathy at her, she would probably have cried.
Don't be silly. What do I matter? Do you go back and keep an eye on the children?
So long as mothers are like this, their children will take advantage of them.
Even now, we venture into that familiar nursery only because its lawful occupants are on their way home.
We're merely hurrying on in advance of them to see that their beds are properly aired.
And that Mr. and Mrs. Darling do not go out for the evening.
Why on earth should their beds be properly aired, seeing that they left them in such a thankless hurry? Would it not serve them jolly well right if they came back and found that their parents were spending the weekend in the country?
It would be the moral lesson they have been in need of ever since we met them. But if we contrive things in this way, Mrs. Darling would never forgive us.
One thing I should like to do immensely, and that is to tell her that the children are coming back, that indeed they will be here on Thursday week. This would spoil so completely the surprise to which Wendy and John and Michael are looking forward.
They have been planning it out on the ship.
Mother's rapture,
Father's shout of joy,
Nana's leap through the air to embrace them first.
When what they ought to be prepared for is a good hiding.
How delicious to spoil it all by breaking the news in advance, so that when they enter grandly, Mrs. Darling may not even offer Wendy her mouth, and Mr. Darling may exclaim pettishly,
"Dash it all, here are those boys again."
Mrs. Darling does not really need to be told to have things ready, for they are ready.
All the beds are aired.
And she never leaves the house.
And observe,
the window is open.
For all the use we are to her, we might well go back to the ship.
However, as we are here, we may as well stay and look on.
That is all we are.
Lookers on.
Nobody really wants us.
The only change to be seen is in the night nursery, is that between 9 and 6 the kennel is no longer there. When the children flew away, Mr. Darling felt in his bones that all the blame was his for having chained Nana up, and that from first to last she had been wiser than he.
Of course, as we have seen, he was quite a simple man.
Indeed, he might have passed for a boy again.
But he had a noble sense of justice and a lion's courage to do what seemed right to him. And having thought the matter out with anxious care after the flight of his children, he went down on all fours and crawled into the kennel.
To all Mrs. Darling's dear invitations to him to come out, he replied sadly but firmly,
No, my own one. This is the place for me.
In the bitterness of his remorse, he swore that he would never leave the kennel until his children came back.
Of course, this was a pity.
But whatever Mr. Darling did, he had to do in excess.
Otherwise, he soon gave up doing it. And there never was a more humble man than the once proud George Darling, as he sat in the kennel of an evening talking with his wife of their children and all their pretty ways.
Every morning the kennel was carried with Mr. Darling in it to a cab, which conveyed him to the office, and he returned home in the same way at 6.
Something of the strength of character of the man will be seen if we remember how sensitive he was to the opinion of neighbours. This man, whose every movement now attracted surprised attention.
Inwardly, he must have suffered torture, but he preserved a calm exterior, even when the young criticised his little home.
And he always lifted his hat courteously to any lady who looked inside.
On that eventful Thursday week,
Mrs. Darling was in the night nursery awaiting George's return home.
a very sad-eyed woman.
Upon George's return, after a long and tiring day, he had one request.
Won't you play me to sleep on the nursery piano?
And as she was crossing to the day nursery, he added thoughtlessly,
And shut that window. I feel a draught.
George, never ask me to do that. The window must always be left open for them. Always, always.
She went into the day nursery and played, and soon.
and while he slept, Wendy and John and Michael flew into the room.
Oh no, we have written it, so.
Because that was the charming arrangement planned by them before we left the ship.
But something must have happened since then, for it is not they who have flown in.
It is Peter and Tinkerbell.
Peter's first words tell all.
Nick, Tink, close the window, bar it. That's right. Now, you and I must get away by the door, and when Wendy comes, she will think her mother has barred her out, and she will have to go back with me.
Now I understand what had hitherto puzzled me. Why, when Peter had exterminated the pirates, he did not return to the island and leave Tink to escort the children to the mainland.
This trick had been in his head all the time.
Instead of feeling that he was behaving badly, he danced with glee.
Then he peeped into the day nursery to see who was playing. He whispered to Tink,
It's Wendy's mother. She is a pretty lady, but not so pretty as my mother. Her mouth is full of thimbles, but not so full as my mother's was.
Of course, he knew nothing whatsoever about his mother, but he sometimes bragged about her.
You will never see Wendy again, lady, for the window is barred.
He peeped in again to see why the music had stopped, and now he saw that Mrs. Darling had laid her head on the box and that 2 tears were sitting on her eyes.
She wants me to unbar the window, but I won't, not I.
He peeped again, and the tears were still there, or another 2 had taken their place.
She's awfully fond of Wendy,
He said to himself. He was angry with her now for not seeing why she could not have Wendy.
The reason was so simple.
I'm fond of her too. We can't both have her, lady.
But the lady would not make the best of it, and he was unhappy.
He ceased to look at her, But even then she would not let go of him. He skipped about and made funny faces, but when he stopped, it was just as if she were inside him, knocking.
Oh, all right.
He said at last, and gulped. Then he unbarred the window.
Come on, Tink.
He cried with a frightful sneer at the laws of nature.
We don't want any silly mothers.
And he flew away.
Thus John and Wendy and John and Michael found the window open for them after all.
Which of course was more than they deserved.
They alighted on the floor, quite unashamed of themselves, and the youngest one had already forgotten his home.
John, I think I have been here before.
Of course you have, you silly. There is your old bed.
Ah, so it is.
I say, the kennel.
Perhaps Nana is inside it.
Hello? There's a man inside it.
It's Father.
Oh, let me see, Father.
He took a good look.
He is not so big as the pirate I killed.
He said with such frank disappointment that I am glad Mr. Darling was asleep.
Well, it would have been sad if those had been the first words he heard his little Michael say.
He and John had been taken aback somewhat at finding their father in the kennel.
Surely he used not to sleep in the kennel.
John, perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did.
A chill fell upon them.
And serve them right.
It is very careless of Mother not to be here when we come back.
It was then that Mrs. Darling began playing again.
It's Mother!
Ah, so it is.
Then are you not really our mother, Wendy?
Oh dear,
Wendy displayed her first real twinge of remorse.
it was quite time we came back.
Let us creep in and put our hands over her eyes.
But Wendy, who saw that they must break the joyous news more gently, had a better plan.
Let us all slip into our beds and be there when she comes in, just as if we had never been away.
And so when Mrs. Darling went back to the night nursery to see if her husband was asleep, all the beds were occupied.
The children waited for her cry of joy, but it did not come.
She saw them, but she did not believe they were there.
You see, she saw them in their beds so often in her dreams that she thought it was just the dream hanging around her still.
She sat down in the chair by the fire, where in the old days she had nursed them. They could not understand this, and a cold fear fell upon all the three of them.
Mother!
That's Wendy.
But still she was sure it was the dream.
Mother!
That's John.
Mother!
That's Michael.
She stretched out her arms for the three little selfish children. They would never envelop again.
Yes, they did. They went round Wendy and John and Michael, who had slipped out of bed and run to her.
George!
Mrs. Darling cried when she could speak.
And Mr. Darling woke to share her bliss.
And Nana came rushing in.
They could not have been a lovelier sight,
But there was none to see it.
except a little boy who was staring in at the window.